Although you are using more fat for fuel when you're on a ketogenic diet, when the calories are the same, it doesn't seem to produce more fat loss. But that doesn't mean it's not useful for fat loss. And boy, oh boy, is it a controversial topic. So for today's video, we've enlisted the help of researcher and physiologist Dr. Mike T. Nelson, and we've looked at a whole ton of studies to figure out the answers to some questions. So we're going to go through what is keto, we're going to talk about some sample ketogenic meals, we're going to examine this fat loss aspect, and then we're going to take a look at this question of whether or not it is better for your brain. So let's get started. So a quick primer on ketosis. What it means is when the body doesn't have enough carbohydrates stored to use for energy, so it switches over to burning fat for fuel instead. To get into that state, you can fast for a pretty long time, but usually ketogenic diets are what people use, and that's when you're consuming like 50 to 60% of your calories from fat, 20 to 30% from protein, and you usually don't want any more than 50 grams of carbohydrates per day. Now, a lot of people confuse low carbohydrate diets with ketogenic diets. They'll think they're in ketosis, but actually they've just cut out a lot of carbohydrates. To actually be in ketosis, you need to have relatively high amounts of ketones in your blood. So what a lot of really dedicated people do, they'll get a blood glucose monitor and a blood stick, they'll check their blood, and they'll make sure they have at least 0.5 millimolars of BHB in their blood. That's beta-hydroxybutyrate, that's a type of ketone. If you have that threshold, you are in ketosis. If not, you're probably just minimizing carbohydrates. So some examples of ketogenic meals would include something like meatballs and cheese on zucchini noodles, or a turkey, avocado, and blue cheese salad, a ribeye and cheesy broccoli, eggs sauteed in lots of butter with spinach, that type of thing. You're not just going low on carbohydrates, you really need a good amount of fat there as well for some fuel. So does all this fat actually lead to fat loss?
So as you do a ketogenic type diet, one of the main things that changes is insulin tends to go down. And why this is important is because as insulin goes down, so lower levels of insulin push your body to use more fat. Ketosis is kind of the backup system to our metabolism to prevent starvation, right? Because we're running through so much body fat at that point, right? Lipids that are stored, a byproduct is ketones, right? And ketones would then be used for the brain specifically.
So you want to lose fat, you've heard about the ketogenic diet, and you're wondering, is it better to be running on fat and ketones than carbohydrates if fat loss is your primary goal? Yes and no. We're going to start with the no. There are a lot of studies that have tried to compare low carb and low fat diets over the years for weight loss. It's pretty hard to lump them all together into one category. First of all, a lot of the low carb ones are not necessarily on ketogenic diets. Also, a lot of them, they'll just kind of tell people to go low fat, tell other people to go ketogenic, but they won't actually track the amount of calories they consume. So to say if it's better for fat loss is a bit more difficult. There's also a lot of studies that compare the two, but they'll only track the calories in the low fat group, and they won't restrict the calories for the low carb group. I don't know why, that's a pretty common method of making these studies. But when the energy is the same, when they're consuming the same amount of calories, the same amount of energy is going into the body, it doesn't really look like any diet is superior for weight loss or fat loss. Some studies do swear that keto results in more weight loss even if calories are exactly the same, but the general consensus and general science suggests if you're eating the same amount of energy, you're going to lose the same amount of weight or gain the same amount of weight. Now, you are burning more fat for fuel, so a lot of people hear that and they figure that means they're going to be losing a lot more body fat, but the fact is a lot of that fat is coming from the fat that you're eating, not necessarily the fat on your body. However,
you could argue that if you're in the free living world, that ketogenic diets do seem to have a higher satiety. So if you put someone on a ketogenic diet, they do tend to eat less, even though they don't feel like they're eating less. So in free living subjects, that can be a positive.
And this is really important to emphasize because the average person has no interest in tracking their calories or weighing their food. And when no one is told to track their calories, when they're just kind of sent out into the world and told to only eat ketogenic meals, well, all that fat is very filling. And in studies where that happens, yeah, you do tend to see more weight loss among people following ketogenic diets. Now, there may be some other elements at play here, like some research suggests that ketogenic diets might decrease the amount of ghrelin in your system, which is like an appetite-stimulating hormone. But look, more likely it's that there's a lot of food you can't eat. A lot of the stuff you normally snack on, like, pretzels and ice cream, chips, that sort of thing, they're just not ketogenic. You can't consume them. So to that extent, I think a lot of the weight loss with ketosis might be the same reason you see a lot of weight loss in like paleo diets and vegan diets. There's just a lot of food you are no longer able to eat. That said, adhering to a ketogenic diet, it is very difficult. It's a complicated diet, and to go from never tracking your calories to getting this very rigid diet, it can be tough for some people, and a decent amount of studies have shown that adherence to the diet is a really big stumbling block. But if you're happy to stick to ketogenic meals, might help with weight loss. So what about the other alleged health benefits of going keto? The diet was actually originally devised like in the 1920s because it was found that among people with epilepsy, some research suggests that more than half of people with this condition experience a really big reduction in seizures when following a ketogenic diet. So this has led a lot of people to wonder if it's just good for the brain, like anybody's brain, the average person's brain.
One, there's a massive difference between people who are healthy and people who have a frank pathology. So if you have a pathology, you have type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's disease, or you get whacked on the head and have a TBI, I think you could make an argument that a ketogenic diet may be very beneficial for those populations, but that's also a pathology. So that's completely different physiology than what a healthy person would have. It's just like the same thing saying, oh, couch potato physiology is the same as athlete physiology. It's like, no, they might as well be almost two different species. They're very different.
Indeed, there is some evidence that it might be useful for managing like Parkinson's, ALS, maybe traumatic brain injuries. These are big maybes, but there is some interesting evidence out there. There's also something called the Warburg effect, which suggests that cancer cells predominantly are fueled by glycolysis, like glycogen, carbohydrates. So maybe if you starve them of carbohydrates, it might help to kill cancer cells. There's like some studies on cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy that have improved outcomes. But look, these are really big maybes. Most of this stuff is theoretical. I'm not at all saying this is like the best way to treat cancer or anything like that. This research is all ongoing. And again, we're still not really talking about healthy people with healthy systems. Like, does ketosis improve the functioning of the brain for the average healthy person? Well, a lot of people report like less brain fog and improved mental clarity on a ketogenic diet. There have been some rodent studies that have suggested as much. There have been a few studies on older adults with impaired cognition that had improved cognition with the ketogenic diet. There's a lot less evidence for regular healthy people. There is some, but not as much as we would like.
I would disagree with the statement that, for the healthiest brain possible, you have to do a ketogenic diet. I don't think that's true in healthy populations. Give someone a supplement to put them in a state of ketosis, and if they go, wow, my brain works a lot better, I wonder if your glucose metabolism is maybe not the best in your brain. So we give it another fuel source, we give it BHB, and all of a sudden your brain works better, however you define that. That makes me wonder about what your baseline state of glucose metabolism was in your brain. So I think it's very confusing for healthy populations right now.
Now look, I am not a doctor, but the mental clarity thing is pretty interesting, but we don't have a ton of evidence on healthy, non-impaired, non-elderly people. But if that's the reason you want to try out this diet, it might be worth tinkering with, but I do really need to emphasize here in conclusion, the diet is pretty hard to follow for the average person. It can be pretty rough in your social life, and it can be pretty tough on working out, especially for higher volume workouts that require a lot of glycogen. Now that's not to say that it's a useless diet. A lot of people really, really thrive on it. It's just for a lot of people, especially people who are new to dieting, it can be a bit more work than they were expecting. So that's everything from me on this topic. I really want to thank Dr. Mike T. Nelson for coming on and giving his thoughts. The ketogenic diet, it is controversial, but it does seem to work pretty well for some people. Some people it doesn't really work well at all. So you kind of just need to try it out if you're interested in doing it and if it seems like it's worth all that work. But before you do that, I really strongly urge you to talk to your physician or a dietitian or a nutritionist beforehand, because this stuff is pretty tough, it's pretty complicated, and it's really good to have some help along the way. So that's everything from me. I did write a full article as to whether or not the ketogenic diet can be useful for athletes. If you want to check that out, it's in the description below, and make sure you subscribe.